There's lots of information. It's very close by. And for things like books and movies and restaurants, there's actually a very established way of determining quality. I think for many of us, when we go out to a restaurant, we'll take a look at Yelp, or we'll look at Zagat, we'll look at Michelin. If we're going to movies, we're looking at Rotten Tomatoes. If we're looking at books, there are all sorts of indices about what is a good book or not. But for apps, there's actually very little data that guides you to what's good. There are services and there are tools, techniques, and approaches that help us to narrow it down. And a lot of that is a top 10 list, which is sort of the wisdom of the crowds, that there are good apps. But the problem with our current approach is that we're treating how we discover software very much like how we discover websites. And the consequence for getting a not so good website is very small. You hit the back button, you go to Google, and you try again. For mobile apps, you have to make a purchase many times. You certainly have to download it. You have to use it, and then you have to make a decision to keep or delete. And I talked this morning about my own family's experience with the $2,000 Amazon app. There are privacy issues. There's issues of giving over information that you have. And it's not to put in the dun-dun-dun music that something terrible is necessarily going to happen, but you do have to make an investment. And to not know much about the piece of software that you're downloading puts you at a huge disadvantage. And we see the consequence of that. 9 out of 10 apps that are downloaded are used once. And I also think that the size of the market is severely constrained. People aren't comfortable going out and buying an app because they're not sure what it's going to do, and they're not sure of the quality that it has. And the key questions that people want to understand are not answered. And it's the basic kinds of things that we want to understand about any piece of software. How will this app perform, and what does it do? And so I'm going to turn it over to V to talk a little bit about what we're doing with the appscore to help address some of these issues.
Thank you. Which arrow do I press?
Yeah, whichever one, forward or back.
And so I was up here last year talking about the appscore at exact same time. And the story for us last year was wading through just the sheer amount of metadata that's available. How do we distill insights from just the sheer amount of data that's out there, from the app description to the millions and billions of user reviews and to screenshots, and really just trying to struggle with that and distill some sort of insight. I'm happy to report that this year we took a step back and decided to throw a lot of that away. And the goal really was to dig deep into the psychology of a consumer mindset. How do they approach shopping for books, movies, restaurants, drawing parallels from other industries, and trying to get down to a very fundamental level. And along the way, we concluded that there's a lot of noise out there, but there's really no relevant information. And as Trevor mentioned, the two very, very basic questions that people want to know about any given piece of software is unanswered. And so what we did was started to develop a lot of new technologies that allow us to gather that data and build a knowledge base around that. One of the things that we did is we actually started collecting and analyzing all of the APKs on Google Play, millions of them. A lot of what we did before was really to try and approximate how the app performs and answer these questions based on the metadata. Then we sort of asked ourselves, why don't we just measure that directly? So we built out physical testing stations, hooked it up to popular devices on the market, and started running the apps through tests of our own, decompiling the app, looking inside to see, really what are the developers doing, what are key APIs, what are SDKs, and being able to assign performance scores based on that. Additionally, we built out a heat map technology that gathers a lot of user interaction with specific types of applications and used it to build out a smart AI model that really tries to simulate an average user's interaction with the app. We, added that to our widgets, performance widgets, to measure the real-time performance of applications on physical devices, to be able to let consumers, know at a glance what's the average memory usage, what's the battery, what's the memory leak of any of, this particular app on my device. The second thing that we focused on is a combination of what I call a features list and sentiment. Now, everybody is familiar with sentiment, and that's kind of a loaded word. In a lot of services, when you're talking about sentiment, you look at a lot of high sentiment, but what I call low meaning words. They're words like, I love this app, it's addicting, that while convey very high levels of emotion, really don't mean much to any average user out of context. So when we went back to our metadata, we really approached it with a much more structured approach. So to pull out phrases that we thought were correspondent to actual implications about a behavior of an app, and to map that to very specific sentiments associated with those specific performance features. So you can see here is a sample of an education application that we were looking at. Highlighting, you can see that the app helps to say and write, teaches kids how to say and write a letter to sing along with the alphabet, and then to map that to user reviews, either criticizing the pronunciation of the application, of words within the application, and being able to correlate that into a behavioral matrix. That we can then use to standardize app performance as well as app behavior. And to sort of take this point home, I wanted to produce a simple hypothetical case study. So imagine a parent going to the App Store trying to look for a very basic education app to teach their kids how to say the ABCs. And these are the top 2 links that pop up in Google Play. And this is the data that they have right now. One is free, one costs money, one has a much higher install base, but the other one has a higher average rating. And the main question really, they're both ABC apps, but the question is, I don't want to download both because there's just so many apps on my phone, and that one costs money where this one is free. So really, what's the difference? And after thinking that through, you've sort of come to the conclusion that the only way to tell is to try and wade through just the vast amounts of user reviews available on these applications. And a couple hours and thousands of irrelevant reviews later, you're really nowhere closer because you've been trying to go through thousands of reviews to look for a specific use case of a specific user who's compared both applications and who you think is a similar, profile to yourself and would provide relevant information. What we want to do is, what about if there was a feature list that for every application provided at a glance exactly what that app does and the behaviors that it enables the user to do. So for example, the feature list, on ABC, it's ad supported, to know that it has access to a YouTube channel, which, can be potentially dangerous for a kid with an app by themselves, depending on the age. And you can see that while they're both ABC apps, the differences, there's a very clear difference in functionality. And to be able to compare these two at a glance in a very simple chart makes what would be a very painful decision very painless, and would make the case for purchasing the $2.99 app if you were interested in teaching your kids more advanced stuff rather than just singing along with the alphabet. So this sort of very basic case study is what we want to make available for all of the apps in the store, for people to be able to come to our site and see all of the relevant information that they need to without having to wade through just the vast amount of data out there. And we're not really trying to predict which apps customers will download or buy. We actually want to inform their purchase decision when they're making that decision point, when they're deciding which apps are right for them, when they've narrowed it down to the subset of apps that they think are relevant. Of those, which one should they eventually bite the bucket? And people do not find apps in just one place. It's very distributed where they're getting their information. And while referrals from friends and family are trusted because you have some contextual information on whether these people have similar tastes as yourself, third-party websites, among other apps, ads, newspapers, magazines. There's a lot of different sources that could potentially help you discover new content that you would like, but at the same time, they all require a level of trust. And so I'd like to introduce appbackr.org, where no matter where you're getting these app recommendations, to be able to go to one app directory of sorts and search the app that you're looking for, see at a glance, one, does it work on my device? Two, does it do what I need it to do? And to be able to compare that, very clearly and very specifically against other types of applications. Oops. I think I turned it off. Thank you. Questions?
Any questions?
How much of this process is automated?
I would say that we're trying to automate as much of it as we can. So the initial data collection piece of it and compiling the training set is manual, just because unsupervised learning methods, especially for advanced natural language processing, is not developed to a level that we need it to be yet. But once that initial training set is compiled, we're actually able, for maybe a small subset, thousands of applications, we're able to replicate that, very quickly and very accurately for the millions and millions of apps. The heat map tool that we developed is actually very automated. We automatically collect the apps, push them to physical devices, and we run test scripts on them automatically, and the results just get inputted into a database, which we then query from. Yes, we think that certain categories of apps have higher demand now. So for example, education is one that I just brought out. It's in that very unique position where it's both a consumable and a utility. Just because I know we've talked over dinner, with a couple of folks, and the question was how relevant are some of these categories. For example, if you have a utility app that works, you're going to use Evernote, and looking at other competitors and understanding what they do really doesn't matter. And in those types of categories, sometimes there are clear winners, but there's a lot of opportunities in other consumables, games, in education, et cetera.
Have you done blind studies on appscore versus quality or subjective? Acceptance of the app itself. So basically, you can pick up some really popular apps and run it through the rating system, and then see how does that match up, right?
I would almost say that's a difficult question to answer, right? Because a lot of what we're really trying to do with this approach is to remove that subjective element as much as we can from our quality evaluation, which is built into any top chart, any popular list that you're seeing right now. And a lot of, I'm not saying the apps in the top apps don't deserve to belong there, but there are a lot of other apps in the long tail that we think are of equal or of higher quality but have not yet been discovered.
So just because you're in the top 10 doesn't mean that you have merit to be there? I mean,
Not necessarily that you're the best in that field, right?
What sort of trends are you seeing in the top scoring apps out there, in terms of UI, UX?
Well, there's definitely a lot of it is based on performance, and there's a very high sort of visual element to that, right? And I think performance is something that users have come to take for granted, where a bad app, no matter what it's trying to do, if it has a bug or if it lags on the phone, it just immediately gets tossed away. And someone here was talking about how fickle consumers can be, and they download the wrong app, and it gets maybe 5 seconds of time before they decide whether it's worth it or not to keep. But we think a lot of that also stems from users just purchasing the wrong apps in the first place. Because of the lack of all of this relevant information, you're either downloading a bunch of apps and trying to hand curate to one that's useful for you, or you just don't download apps at all. Yes.
You mentioned how you test the APKs a lot and measure performance. If you're, a lot of apps have various SDKs, added SDKs, what have you. If you notice a trend that's impacting performance at a certain SDK, do you tell developers not good because it impacts your app score or do you talk to that SDK developer to build it, saying your SDK is messing up all these apps? What are you doing with that data?
I don't think at this point, we'll be able to talk to the SDKs and tell them specifically, the SDK makers, what's wrong with their SDK and why it's causing performance issues. What we can do and hope to do is to educate the developers that, hey, this SDK is hurting your app performance, and it's increasing your memory and CPU consumption by X%, and compared to your competitors, that's really bad. And to be able to just raise that as a red flag so that they know. Yes.
I know this is kind of a new framework. Can you give some information about where you're at now, like how many apps have been reviewed, or maybe where you hope to be a year from now with this?
So I would say right now we're really building out the tools to try and make it as automated and yet without sacrificing any accuracy or performance. The feature extraction piece of it, we have an initial training set, and we're going through some exercises, and running into basically all of the natural language processing challenges that everybody else is when analyzing user reviews. In terms of, we've made a lot more progress on the technical performance side, in the sense that all of that infrastructure is set up, and we're just really chugging apps along and seeing if we can increase the capacity at which we can analyze applications. But as you know, the time to download and then run tests on them is a couple of minutes per application, and given the sheer volume, it can take a bit of time.
Yeah, the features part of it sounds, when you're comparing the features to, I guess, the expectations expressed in the reviews, that sounds like it's some that labor intensive.
Only if you're doing it manually. So there are a lot of techniques that we've employed to really try, stemming, for example, to be able to relate words from one another, to be able to relate words like say, and that it's connected to pronunciation, and building a library around that. Fortunately, there's a lot of work that's been done and a lot of research that we can leverage, but everything, while applicable, everything has been really done on a very curated data set. So a lot of the research and advancements that have been done in NLP have been done in with very limited data sets that have been manually curated and is very clean. So a lot of the challenge really has been, how do we scale that analysis and make it applicable to real world data?
Machine learning, right? You're looking at, right now, English only, but
Yes.
so the reviews are probably
A nightmare.
Well, but they're also a value asset. They're data behind it, because you're crowdsourcing a very large community.
Absolutely.
On evaluating the app and quality.
Absolutely.
Like, okay, it sucks, horrible, don't download, versus addicting, awesome, great.
Right.
You get these other sentences that.
Right. Well, the sentiment piece of it is very straightforward, because you can pull all of that with a simple keyword extraction. The hard part is relating that back to a specific feature. What aspect of the app is addicting? What, sucks for this particular user, and trying to map that as objectively as we can. Otherwise, we're just a subject to the biases in the user reviews, and all we've really done is summarize that, which is what we're trying to move beyond from.
Maybe one more question. I think we should move on. So.
Not yet. So we do have access to that data, because when you look at an application, you can see if it uses the network, you can see what permissions it requires, and you can even see externally, where it's sending your data. So that's definitely, I think, for a future roadmap for us.